All right, everyone, and I'd like to introduce our next speaker from GrabMaps, Smarter Navigation for two-wheelers in informal transit, leveling up OSM for Southeast Asia. Please allow me to introduce Nilofer Christensen.
Hi. Can everyone at the back hear me? Or should I be a little bit louder? All right, we're good. Okay, cool. Thanks so much for the intro. Actually, I love that presentation. I was just asking how we can bring a working group like that to the part of the world that I come from. So I think we're going to catch up on that later. But I'm a first-timer at State of the Map, so it's really, really exciting to be here. I want to share something from the part of the world that I come from. So I currently live in Singapore, and I want to share a little bit of that part of the world with you all, not just Singapore, but Southeast Asia. So I work at GrabMaps. I head product for consumer maps. And what I want to talk about today is something that's both kind of massive in my part of the world and also invisible, which is how people in Southeast Asian cities actually move. And what we're trying to do, building on top of OSM to create smart navigation for them. So this is a story of, for those of you who haven't traveled through Southeast Asia, it's a story of two-wheelers, informal transit, vehicles that you may never even have heard of, things like jeepneys and angkots, and I'll talk about a bit more about that. It's a story of potholes and flooding and broken traffic signals, and mostly it's just, what happens when you try and map all of that chaos into something that's usable. So I hope you enjoy it, and if you have been to Southeast Asia, you'll probably recognize some of the stuff I present here. If you haven't, then I hope it's a little bit enlightening anyways. So here's the deal, right? There's more than 700 million people in Southeast Asia, and I'm talking about not only Singapore, but Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia, Thailand, the Philippines. And that's twice the population of the United States. So that's a huge number, just to put that in perspective. And these are people who don't travel like people in the West do, right? They don't drive cars on clean, structured, wide streets, right? They're riding, they're weaving, right? And so some of the navigation tools that we build need to be adapted for the way that they travel. And one of the main reasons is because, a scooter or a motorbike, it's not just a small car, right? You've got in Indonesia actually 80% of all vehicles that are motorbikes. In Vietnam, ownership is closer to 87%. In the Philippines, if you don't have a motorbike, you're probably borrowing someone else's, right? This is not a niche. It's not a niche. It's the operating environment that we come from. And you can talk to my folks, come to our booth, and you can learn a little bit more about the operating environment that we come from. So what does this environment actually look like, right? So you've got really narrow streets. Often they're just barely wide enough for a two-wheeler, right? You've got unpredictable traffic. You could have a bus that's cutting across 4 lanes, or you could have kids walking in between cars, right? This is a daily occurrence. You've got broken signals, or you could have massive intersections that actually have no traffic signals at all. And then you've got bikes carrying heavy loads, right? It could be a crate of eggs, or it could be 3 family members in the back, right? This is how people travel every day in Southeast Asia. It's not cars on clean, structured roads. You've got 80% or more of the population traveling on two-wheelers. And this is their everyday life. I'm going to add another layer of complexity here. Anyone traveled quite a bit or lived in Southeast Asia here? Yay! So I only moved to Southeast Asia about 2.5 years ago. I was living in Northern Europe for a long time. I grew up in Australia. So believe it or not, this was actually quite unusual for me as well. My parents are Indian, so I do have a heritage here, but I grew up in the West. So when I moved to Southeast Asia 2.5 years ago and took on this project to map the chaos, this was eye-opening for me as well, right? What you have in Southeast Asia is these types of vehicles that you see up on the screen, right? Jeepneys, angkots, songtos. What they are, for those of you who haven't traveled through Southeast Asia, you can think of them as like a small people mover, right? You've got like a small van or it could be a small truck or like a stretch Jeep. These tend to have fixed routes, but there's no fixed pickup or drop-off points. Right? You stand along the road and you hail one down, and you can jump in and out anywhere along the route. Right? So there's no schedules, there's no timetables, there's no GTFS feeds. Right? So you're actually trying to make what's invisible visible. But this is how so many people travel, because informal transit like this, it basically covers the gaps where formal transit can't reach. Right? It's also really affordable, it's flexible, and it's deeply local. There's 40 million trips a day in the Philippines on jeepneys, 40 million trips a day, and that's just one country, right? So it's a massive invisible network that we're trying to map. So when this is your commuting reality, it's not turn-by-turn perfection you're looking for, right? That's not what you want. What you care about is the uncertainty. Am I going to get stuck somewhere, right? You care about your personal safety. If I take this shortcut, am I putting myself at risk, right? You care about efficiency. Can I save fuel if I take this particular route? Because what's the cost of a bad route in this context, right? It's not just time. It could be your personal safety. It could be exhaustion. It could be an increased spend on fuel. You're basically impacting your own earnings. That's the cost of a bad route in this environment. So what we started doing at Grab Maps is when you're in this operating environment, we decided, okay, we need to rethink the fundamentals, right? Instead of just optimizing for the fastest route, we said, okay, we need to optimize for things that actually matter and how people actually ride. So left turns versus a U-turn, right? Because not every turn is created equal. Signal avoidance, because on certain routes, the traffic signal can add 3 or 5 minutes to your journey, and that's lost earnings. Rolling stop intersections. I know that's illegal in many parts of the world, but it actually does matter, right? And it does save a lot of time. Because when we get this right, we're not just improving the map. We're actually improving the livelihood of the millions of people who are using our maps. And then there's the chaos that we can't plan for, right? Has anyone been to Manila? Have you been to Manila in the rainy season? Yeah? You got lots of roads that turn into shallow rivers, right? So there's flooding during the monsoon season, there's potholes and roadworks, there's street parades, there's religious processions, there's pop-up markets, right? These are things that disrupt roads in Southeast Asia every day. This is a daily occurrence, right? These are temporary, they're hyper-local, and they're completely undocumented. But they absolutely affect routing, right? Because if you're a two-wheeler, or you're an informal transit vehicle, you don't have the luxury of saying, I'll just take the highway instead, right? You don't have that luxury. Sorry, am I depressing everyone? Everyone's like, oh my God, it's not a problem we can solve. Well, look at the problems the OSM community has solved together, right? And this is something we are solving, and we're solving it together. So it's okay. My presentation has a silver lining at the end. Promise everyone's going to be cheery, right? So I'm going to present some of the challenges first, and then some of the opportunities, right? How does this play out in OSM? There's really some core things that we can collaborate on adding together, right? That's better bike or two-wheel restrictions, reliable signal data or turn cost estimates. There's tagging around the informal stops and terminals, and there's some way to try and reflect this kind of dynamic disruption, right? And a lot of this is missing. And it's not because the community in Southeast Asia is not active. It is very active, right? It's just because a lot of our tools and assumptions, they're not built for these use cases in mind, right? And that's exactly what we're trying to change together. Also, often where the data exists, it's quite static. What we're trying to do at Grab Maps is reflect how people actually behave and how they actually ride, right? A rider that's avoiding a particular route because they know from family or friends that there's a road that's flooded, right? Or instinctively they change direction and reroute themselves because they can see a street procession ahead, something that we have not mapped yet, right? So these are the things we're trying to reflect now on the map. And to do that, we need hyperlocal data, right? And often this data comes from the community, from people who are living and breathing it every single day. So here's what we're really excited to partner with OSM and collaborate with the OSM community on, right? It's mapping transit routes, either from observations or GPS traces, and this is the informal transit routes. Mapping any known pickup or drop-off zones, even if they're unofficial, they are being used. So even if they're unofficial, there are known pickup and drop-off zones. There's tags with local context, even if they're like temporary landmarks. They make a huge difference to the way people move. And support for things like GTFS Flex or just flexible stop behavior. And this is best done by people who live there or travel there on a regular basis. They're the ones who can help us to collect this data. And then for two-wheelers, there's more detailed routing constraints. I've already talked about this. Where can bikes turn legally? Where can they cut through or filter forward? Tags that reflect actual rider behavior. And this is probably the most tricky one that I'm sure you've all talked about before, is some way to capture all this dynamic context, right? Things that are changing so often, whether it's flooded roads, it's blocked lanes, it's event closures. So I want to talk a little bit about, just give you a quick example of why this matters, right? I was talking about Manila recently. I was actually in Manila last year at the rainy season, right? And I booked a Grab bike to the office. And about halfway through the journey, we actually hit a road that was flooded. But my driver didn't hesitate at all, right? He took a sharp turn through this narrow alleyway, something I hadn't even seen. I was on the back of the bike, I didn't even see it, right? There was no signage, there was no map indication, there was nothing, but he just knew, right? And not only was it a safer, drier road, but we saved a good 10 minutes of the journey, right? And the whole time I'm sitting at the back of the bike and I'm thinking to myself, how do we map that, right? Those micro movements, that kind of instinctive rerouting, that local knowledge. And if we can bring even that small bit of that local intelligence to OSM, it'll reflect how people actually behave, and it'll truly make the invisible visible. So in conclusion, let's map what actually matters, right? And I do think that two-wheel transit in my part of the world and informal transit deserves the same quality of data, right? We need to make these invisible systems visible so city can plan better. It also supports inclusive mobility for the millions of people who are not driving by cars every day. And it also helps to give back time, safety, and earnings to the people that it matters most to. We are doing this, and we love to collaborate. I'm going to give a really quick plug to my GrabMap's incredible colleagues. We've just, not related to this, but we've just released more than 2,000 kilometers of data, of 360 imagery for Seattle. So come to our booth, talk to us more about that. You can now also sync your card view imagery with Mapillary, sorry, my bad. So come and talk to my colleagues about all of that. Super exciting things we're doing. Come and talk to me about any two-wheel working groups that we can set up in my part of the world. We're so excited to collaborate on this, and we can help solve mobility issues for millions of people. Thank you so much. I'm here if you have any questions.